Chapter 43. The Christmas Eve Ball, a night of Gothic splendor. The Addams mansion, already a monument to Gothic beauty, had been transformed for the Christmas Eve ball. The grand ballroom was bathed in flickering candlelight, the massive chandeliers casting long, dramatic shadows over the polished black marble floor. Crimson roses and ivy wove through the iron railings of the grand staircase, their deep hues standing stark against the darkened wood. Enchanted snowflakes drifted lazily from the vaulted ceiling, vanishing just before they could touch the guests. The attendees, an eclectic mix of the Addams family, old aristocratic monsters, and creatures of the night, moved like wraiths through the ballroom, dressed in their finest dark attire. The string quartet played a haunting melody, their notes weaving through the air like whispers from another time. At the top of the grand staircase, Tyler adjusted the cuffs of his suit, waiting as Wednesday descended the steps beside him. He had cleaned up well, his usual scruffy appearance replaced with an elegance befitting the occasion. He wore a deep black suit, tailored to perfection, with a dark crimson shirt beneath. His vest was embroidered with intricate swirling patterns, subtle yet striking, and his cufflinks, silver with obsidian inlays, glinted under the candlelight. A pocket watch chain draped from his waistcoat, adding a touch of old-world sophistication to his look. Wednesday, in contrast, was a vision of Gothic refinement. She wore a floor-length gown of deep onyx, the fabric sleek and shimmering like liquid midnight. The high neckline was adorned with intricate lace detailing, cascading down her arms in delicate, web-like patterns. The bodice fit snugly, accentuating her sharp, elegant frame, while the skirt flowed behind her like the trailing shadow of a spectre. Her hair was styled in its usual sleek braids, though tonight, small obsidian hairpins shaped like ravens adorned the crown of her head. Tyler smirked, giving her an approving glance. "You look," he exhaled, searching for the right word. "Like something out of a dark fairy tale." Wednesday met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "And you look slightly less like a rabid animal. A Christmas miracle." Tyler chuckled, offering her his arm. "Shall we, my dark queen?" She hesitated for only a second before placing her hand on his forearm. "Try not to embarrass yourself." "Can't make any promises." As they descended the staircase together, the crowd below parted, all eyes turning toward them with interest. The hunt had ended, but the night was just beginning. The grand ballroom of the Addams mansion shimmered with an otherworldly elegance, reminiscent of a bygone era. It was as if time itself had stilled, allowing the ghosts of old-world aristocracy to dance once more beneath the flickering glow of candlelit chandeliers. The scent of aged wine, dark roses, and faint incense perfumed the air, mingling with the distant echo of haunting violin strains. Velvet curtains, embroidered with silver filigree, draped over arched windows that overlooked the sprawling estate, their heavy folds whispering secrets in the evening breeze. Marble statues of forgotten figures stood in the corners like silent sentinels, their hollow eyes seeming to watch over the guests as they moved in effortless grace. The attendees were creatures of old wealth and darker bloodlines, vampiric nobles in waistcoats and opera gloves, ghostly debutantes swathed in satin and lace, and sorcerers in intricately tailored frock coats adorned with amulets of arcane power. The colors of their attire remained true to the Addams aesthetic, deep obsidian, wine-stained crimson, and the occasional silver or emerald thread woven in for contrast. At the center of the ballroom, couples glided across the polished marble floor, their movements impossibly fluid, as though they belonged to a world just outside of time. The waltz they danced to was slow, deliberate, every step a testament to the refinement of the gathering. As Wednesday and Tyler descended the staircase, their presence did not go unnoticed. A tall, silver-haired gentleman in a tailcoat turned his head, his sharp eyes, glowing faintly, like embers in the dark, trailing over the pair. "Ah, the young Addams," he murmured, his voice carrying the crisp refinement of a bygone century. "And her beast." His companion, a statuesque woman in an elegant gown of dark emerald silk, tilted her head. "How charming," she mused, swirling the blood-red wine in her goblet. "They do make a striking pair." Across the room, Adele, effortlessly poised with a martini in hand, caught sight of them and smirked. "Finally, our beloved little Wednesday has found her perfect contrast." A monster in fine clothing, how delightfully poetic. Judah, who stood beside her, gave an amused hum. Let's see if he dances. Wednesday and Tyler reached the ballroom floor, moving through the crowd with the same air of untouchable grace as those around them. Though Tyler's presence was somewhat rougher around the edges, there was something magnetic about the way he carried himself tonight. The hide still lurked beneath his skin, and perhaps that was why the ancient aristocrats eyed him with interest. He was not one of them, yet he belonged in their world of shadows and whispered decadence. A waltz began anew, the strings rising with an ethereal, mournful beauty. Without preamble, Tyler turned to Wednesday, offering his hand with an almost lazy smirk. Care to dance? Wednesday eyed him for a moment, then slowly placed her hand in his. If you can keep up. Tyler pulled her in, one hand settling at her waist, the other clasping hers with surprising finesse. The moment they stepped into the music, it was as though the room had dimmed, and the dance floor was theirs alone. He moved well, too well for someone who had never been taught the formalities of such an era. Wednesday noticed, though she said nothing. The fluidity of his steps, the way he anticipated her movements, he was good. Where did you learn this? She asked, their voices low, for each other's ears alone. Tyler chuckled, the sound deep and velvety. You'd be surprised what you can pick up when you're forced to blend in. Or, she mused, tilting her head slightly, perhaps Hyde has a memory for things beyond bloodlust. His eyes gleamed, the candlelight catching something unreadable in his expression. Maybe he does. The music swelled, and he spun her, once, twice, before pulling her back into his arms. The motion sent the train of her gown fanning out in a cascade of midnight silk, her raven hair catching the light as though woven with the night itself. From the edge of the ballroom, Gomez and Morticia watched with knowing smiles. She reminds me of you, Gomez murmured, eyes alight with devotion. Morticia's lips curved into a slow, satisfied smile. And he reminds me of you. The night, dark and endless, continued its spellbinding waltz. Lurch moved like a silent specter through the crowd, his towering frame casting long shadows across the flickering candlelight. His polished black suit was immaculate, his expression unreadable as he carried a silver tray laden with crystal goblets filled with dark wine. Thing, perched atop another tray, scuttled effortlessly between guests, expertly maneuvering around trailing skirts and shifting bodies as he passed glasses of champagne to awaiting hands. The Addams family servants, ghoulish but efficient, moved with an eerie grace, their pale faces expressionless as they catered to the whims of the guests. The drinks they carried shimmered under the ballroom's haunting glow, their deep crimson and gold hues standing out starkly against the sea of black-clad aristocrats. The grandeur of the evening had begun to shift. While some couples still waltzed in the center of the ballroom, others had dissolved into smaller groups, their conversations hushed but no less intriguing. The Addamses, in particular, had gathered in their own clusters, discussing matters that only those of their lineage could understand. Near the grand fireplace, Morticia and Gomez held court, speaking in rich, poetic tones with an ancient vampire lord whose skin was the shade of moonlight. Adele, reclining gracefully on a velvet chaise, laughed softly at something Felix had whispered, her martini glass held lightly in her fingers. Pugsley and Calliope were deep in conversation with one of the Addams cousins, undoubtedly plotting some manner of delightful chaos. And then there was Leah. She had once thought she would never belong here. Last spring, when she and Judah had first announced their engagement, she had been tiptoeing through these halls, uncertain of how to navigate a family that thrived in the darkness while she had spent her life in the light. The weight of expectations had pressed heavily on her then, the need to adapt, to fit the aesthetic, to prove she was worthy of marrying into a dynasty like this one. And yet now, as she stood among them, speaking effortlessly with Morticia and Adele, she realized how much had changed. The pressure had faded, replaced with a strange sense of ease. She had spent so much time envying how effortlessly Tyler fit into the Addams family, how, even as just Wednesday's boyfriend, he had found their rhythm long before she did. But now she could laugh at her own anxieties. And yet here she was, engaged, ring on her finger, a future already decided, and only now did she truly feel as though she belonged. She was here. she was part of this. She turned, catching Judah's eye across the room. He smiled at her, his usual, knowing smirk, but there was something deeper in his gaze, something warm. Yes, she was home now. And yet, as the evening pressed on and the ballroom swayed with quiet laughter and elegant movements, something unseen shifted in the shadows. Unbeknownst to anyone, Calpurnia Addams had slipped away. Her silhouette disappeared beyond the grand double doors, vanishing into the darkened corridors of the mansion. Outside the grand ballroom, the night stretched cold and unforgiving. Snow blanketed the cobblestone paths in pristine white, the frost-covered statues lining the garden standing like silent sentinels beneath the pale glow of the moon in the Addams estate. Calpurnia stood at the edge of the courtyard, her fur-lined cloak trailing behind her as she faced the man who had long since lost the right to be in her presence. Morgan Vale. Once, he had been nothing, just another charming but aimless social climber who had stumbled into fortune the day he met her. His words had been his greatest weapon, a silver tongue capable of weaving poetry from lies. And for a time, she had allowed herself to believe him. That was before he betrayed her. Before he disgraced himself. Before he thought he could walk away from the Addams family and still hold any power in his hands. Now, standing before her in the snow, he was a far cry from the polished, well-kept man he had once been. His dark coat was fine but slightly worn, his gloves fraying at the seams. He had always dressed the part of a man of means, even when he had none. But she knew the truth. He was drowning. And like the rat he was, he had come scurrying back, desperate to take what he could. Morgan smirked, stuffing his gloved hands into his pockets as he regarded her with an infuriating ease. Calpurnia. You look stunning, as always. It's been too long. Her dark eyes remained cold, unmoved by the charm that had once ensnared her. You've got some nerve asking for custody of Calliope when you're nothing but opportunistic trash. Morgan let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Come now, darling, that's no way to greet the father of your child. Father? Calpurnia scoffed, tilting her head. You were barely a husband. And you certainly were never a father. He sighed, the faux disappointment in his voice grating. You wound me, truly. But let's not pretend you're the victim here. I was cast out, forced to start from nothing while you remained in the warm embrace of your dear, dreadful family. You got to keep the wealth, the name, the legacy. And what did I get? Calpurnia smirked. The whore you betrayed me with, I presume? His jaw tightened, but he recovered quickly, offering her a charming grin that no longer had any effect on her. A temporary lapse in judgment, I admit. But you and I both know that's not why I left. She arched a brow. Oh? Do enlighten me. Morgan stepped closer, lowering his voice as though weaving a secret meant only for them. I outgrew this family. I outgrew you. You think I wanted to be another footnote in the Addams dynasty? Another husband swallowed up by the shadows of his wife's name? No, Calpurnia, I built something for myself. I made a name beyond this cursed house. She laughed. A low, amused sound that cut through the cold air like a blade. You think I don't know, she murmured, her smile sharp as she stepped forward, tilting her head as if studying something pitiful. You're in debt, Morgan. His smirk faltered. She leaned in, her voice softer, but no less cutting. You've never been a sensible businessman. Always biting off more than you can chew, thinking you could buy power the way you bought favors. Her gaze flicked over him, unimpressed. And now, after all your schemes and failed ventures, you've come crawling back. Not for Calliope, not for family, but for the fortune you think you're owed. Morgan exhaled, his composure slipping for just a fraction of a second before he straightened. You're wrong, he said smoothly, his voice a practiced blend of hurt and reason. Calliope is my daughter. She deserves to know her father. Calpurnia's smile remained, but her eyes burned with something far colder than the night around them. It's quite fitting, isn't it, she mused, stepping back, her gaze sweeping over him with unmasked contempt. Now you're right back in the trash where I found you. Morgan clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists at his sides. But before he could deliver whatever sweetened lie he had prepared next, a shift in movement caught her attention. Behind the frost-kissed window of the ballroom, a figure stood watching. Tyler. He had been speaking with Judah, but something had pulled his gaze outside. His green eyes, keen even in the dim light, flickered between Calpurnia and Morgan with an unreadable expression. She wondered how much he had heard. How much he had understood. Because if there was anyone who could see through Morgan's facade, it was a man who knew what it meant to have a monster lurking beneath his own skin. Morgan moved fast. Calpurnia had barely taken a step back before he lunged, his hands reaching for her throat with desperate force. The years of charm and deception fell away, revealing the cornered, furious man beneath, a man who had lost everything and now sought to take whatever power he could in his final, pitiful attempt. But Calpurnia Addams had not survived this long by being weak. She twisted, sidestepping him with elegant precision. The sharp blade hidden beneath the folds of her cloak flashed in the moonlight as she drew it, the cool steel glinting against the snow. Morgan was sloppy in his rage. He swung at her, but she ducked, moving with the deadly grace her family was known for. One fluid motion, a calculated strike. The knife plunged into his abdomen. Morgan gasped, his breath hitching as he staggered, eyes wide in disbelief. Calpurnia didn't hesitate. She twisted the blade deeper, her expression impassive as blood spilled onto the pristine snow. He sputtered, a choked, wet sound, before collapsing to his knees. You bitch. She leaned down, her lips ghosting his ear. You were always going to die in the gutter, Morgan. I'm just expediting the process. With a final, decisive motion, she dragged the blade upward. His body jerked once, then went still. The snow absorbed the warmth of his blood, staining it dark beneath him. A beat of silence followed. Then the sound of approaching footsteps. Tyler, Judah, and Uncle Fester strode out from the ballroom doors, their figures casting long shadows against the cold night. Judah took in the sight before him, the still body, the crimson-streaked snow, Calpurnia standing over her ex-husband without a single trace of remorse, and let out a low, unimpressed sigh. Great. Another Aunt Debbie, he sneered, then glanced at Fester. No offense, Uncle Fester. None taken, Fester replied cheerfully. Judah stepped closer, nudging Morgan's body with his foot. So, how do we explain his disappearance? Calpurnia wiped her blade against Morgan's coat, the motion practiced and unbothered. He's been running from debt collectors for over a year. He even borrowed from loan sharks. If he vanishes, everyone will assume it was them. Fester hummed in agreement. What about his mistress? She left him when he started racking up debt. Calpurnia straightened, tucking the blade away. No one's coming to look for him. A low chuckle filled the night air. It wasn't Tyler. The hide had taken over, his presence unmistakable in the way his stance shifted, more predatory, more eager. He rolled his shoulders, cracking his neck as he eyed the corpse with an almost boyish enthusiasm. You want me to chop him up? The hide asked, his grin sharp as a blade. Calpurnia gave him a fond smile, ever appreciative of his enthusiasm. No, dear, but thank you. There's no reason for you to get blood stains on your fine tailored suit. Tyler, watching from the back of his own mind, could only sigh as the hide pouted slightly but ultimately conceded. Judah clapped his hands together. Well then. Let's get to work. They moved like seasoned professionals. Judah and Uncle Fester expertly decapitated Morgan's body, ensuring that no identifying features remained. Calpurnia assisted with quiet efficiency, her hands steady as they stripped away any lingering evidence. When all was said and done, they hauled his remains toward the farthest end of the estate, where the infamous Addams quicksand pit lay in wait. Judah tossed Morgan's head in first, watching as it sank without a trace. Then, with a theatrical flourish, he threw the rest of the body in, followed by the man's car, for good measure. The pit swallowed everything whole, as if the night itself conspired to erase Morgan Vale from existence. Calpurnia watched with a nonchalant expression, the weight of the evening pressing down on her not due to the murder, but due to the lecture she knew was coming from the elders. They were going to be so dramatic about this. The silence of the night was shattered by the crisp sound of a boot crunching against the snow. Tyler, Judah, Uncle Fester, and Calpurnia all turned sharply, instincts honed by years of living under the Addams name. And there she stood. Wednesday Addams. Dressed in black, her silhouette stark against the pale snow, she observed the scene with an unreadable expression. The dim glow of the moon reflected in her dark eyes, which flicked from the quicksand pit to the bloodied snow before settling on Calpurnia. A slow blink. A tilt of the head. Then. Told you so. Calpurnia exhaled through her nose. You are many things, Wednesday, but helpful is not one of them. Wednesday's lips twitched in the closest thing she ever gave to amusement. Then, without further ado, she reached out and grabbed Tyler's hand. Let's go. You don't want to be caught in the crossfire between Calpurnia and the elders. Tyler hesitated. His fingers twitched in hers, but his gaze lingered on Calpurnia, something unreadable flickering behind his green eyes. Inside his mind, the Hyde scoffed. You're not feeling sorry for the poor fool, are you? He had it coming. He should have thought twice before crossing the Addams family. Tyler inhaled, but his grip in Wednesday's hand tightened. It's not the idiot I'm feeling sorry for. His gaze was locked onto Calpurnia. She wasn't shaken, of course, she wasn't. She was an Addams. A murder like this was little more than an inconvenience, an event that would be neatly dealt with and buried in the depths of their estate. But there was something in the way she stood. In the slow, measured breath she took. In the knowledge that while Morgan's fate was sealed, her own was about to be decided by the family she had returned to. Judah clapped her on the shoulder, smirking. Good luck, cousin. Uncle Fester grinned and grabbed her other shoulder. Hang in there, kid. Then, with a dramatic flourish, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the night as though nothing had happened. Calpurnia sighed. Adjusted her cloak. Then, with the air of someone resigned to their fate, she followed them inside. Like, comment and subscribe to be notified for updates in the series.